So this talk is based on, I've been working on this book for about 18 months. So this talk's kind of based on all the ideas I've been looking at so far. And as Niall mentioned, I write a column on personality for the BBC as well. So some of these ideas tie in with that. Okay, I'd like to start by telling you a short story concerning a friend I had at school and this painting, the Verrio, by Antonio Verrio. It's an absolutely enormous painting. It's so big, it's actually in 3 panels. You can't really get an idea from this. To give you some perspective, here it is, it's absolutely enormous. And it's been hanging in the dining hall at Christ's Hospital boarding school for centuries. Now, some visitors and pupils are more awestruck by this painting than others. And when I was at the school in the 1990s, a guy on my year in my boarding house, he certainly was not so impressed. Yeah, I turned those off, yeah. Okay. Yeah, he wasn't so impressed. He was a bit of a rebel, this chap. And one day he decided it would be hilarious to get a great slab of butter, which he stabbed a knife into, and he hurled it as fast as he could at the painting. I think he was aiming for the king's head in the middle. He missed, but it landed with a great splat, and you can imagine it lingered there, and it gradually, over the ensuing weeks and months, it kind of gradually slid down. It was a huge embarrassment to the school because actually this painting acts as the kind of centerpiece for guides of the school. They're called Verrio guides for prospective parents and so on. And depending on who you ask, this chap was either a legend or a hooligan. He was punished at the time, as you can imagine. But even more bizarre was a few years later when we were on our final year at school on the 6th form, my housemaster of my boarding house, when it came to choosing a house captain, which is like head prefect in the boarding house, he chose the butter chucker to be house captain. And the reason I'm telling you this is not out of any lingering resentment after all these years, maybe a little bit, but it's mainly I'm telling you this because actually our housemaster was pretty shrewd, psychologically speaking, because there is a concept in personality literature called social investment theory, which states that our personalities can actually be changed by the social roles we take on, especially if we are very committed to them and we get clear feedback about what is demanded of us in the role and we're very motivated. And that's what happened with my friend who became house captain. He actually thrived in this role, even though he'd been a rebel before. He really thrived. He took on the responsibilities. He took them very seriously, and he was a great role model for... Am I echoing a bit?
Yeah, you just need to move the... Hang on, that's probably because... Move it down onto the other side.
That side.
Sometimes it's just loud.
Yeah. Is that better?
Is it?
Bit less echoey?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, this guy really thrived in this role, and I think it's a really good example of social investment theory, which I'm going to come back to. It's one of the principles I'm going to come back to later in the talk about how our personalities can change through life. So this is my kind of rough lecture plan for today. I'm going to start off... Okay, more feedback there. I'm going to start off by telling you, making the case that personality is incredibly important for our lives and our relationships. I'll tell you about the main personality traits according to modern psychology. And actually, I think I'm going to change. Do you mind if I change to the... I'll try these desk ones. Okay, so... Okay, are they...
Yeah, just switch the other one off.
Yeah, I've switched it off.
Cool.
Yeah, because I'm hearing feedback.
Is it better?
Can you still hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll tell you about kind of the modern psychology's take on what the main personality traits are. And then I'm going to tell you about why, although personality is very important, and there's a thread of continuity in our personality through lives, it's not set in stone. I'm going to take like a 5-minute or so break in the middle, and for that, I'm going to give you some kind of quirky personality tests to look at during that break, and then when we come back, I'll interpret them for you. Then second half, I'm going to move on to how life changes us, changes how the things that happen to us in our life change our personality. And at the same time, we don't have to be passive. We can, by learning about how events change us, we can anticipate them, and we can actually proactively set about changing our personalities through various exercises and being more aware of this scientific literature. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to try and persuade you that personality, as measured by personality psychologists, is important. Now, it helps, I think, just to have an idea what I mean by personality. So this is a kind of back-of-the-envelope description of what I mean by personality. So it's your habitual emotions, like habits of thought, to some extent your cognitive faculties and your ways of relating to others. Crucially, your personality is how you think and act and behave automatically without effort. So, when an extrovert arrives at a party, the extrovert, she doesn't think, now I'm at a party, I'm going to start being all chatty and bubbly. It's what happens automatically, without thinking and without effort. And these aspects of our thoughts, feelings, and behavior, they're the ones that are pervasive over time, and they are shaped about 50-50 by our genes, but also by life experiences. Now, even about just 10 years ago, books on personality, they would tell you that it's early life experiences that shape personality, and then that finishes early in life, kind of the set in stone principle. William James famously said it was like from age 30, our personality is set in plaster. But over the last 10 years, there's a lot more recognition in the field that personality continues to evolve and shift through our lives, right the way through, not only early in life. So you've got about 50-50 here. And then, of course, our personality, therefore, influences our behavior. That then, in turn, of course, has an impact on our life experiences, our health, and our relationships. For example, people who score highly on a trait called neuroticism, which is like emotional instability, they're more likely to get divorced. Just take one example here. And of course, this then feeds back, because obviously how you behave is going to shape your life experiences. Your life experiences actually shape your personality, which we're realizing more and more. So you've got this kind of feedback loop here. And I think, like, last 18 months reading about all this stuff, I'm appreciating more and more. Maybe by appreciating this feedback loop, we can kind of hack into it, exploit that as much as we can. Obviously, some events or lots of events in life are beyond our control. Of course, I appreciate that, but there are some things we can exert control over through our decisions and our behavior and so on. And therefore, we actually end up shaping ourselves and our personality over time. So that's kind of what I mean by personality. And personality, as I mentioned, is incredibly important. This graph shows you how strongly it correlates and predicts risk of dying or mortality in the future. And it's compared here with, so this is IQ, socioeconomic status, and these ones here are personality traits. This one that correlates most strongly with mortality is conscientiousness. And you can see it's more important predictor than intelligence and your how wealthy your background is, the affluence of your background. This is work by Brent Roberts, by the way, at the University of Illinois. And if you are interested in this area after today, a good starting point, I would definitely say, is to look up Brent Roberts. He's a professor in America, and a lot of the research that I've looked into for my book, which is not a textbook, it's for the public, so I'm trying to translate some of this stuff. A lot of it is by Brent Roberts, and I would highly recommend you look him up. Here, this is how much personality traits and other factors predict future occupational success. And you can see, okay, IQ is the most important factor, but again, personality traits more strongly predict occupational success than things like parental income and your socioeconomic status. So your kind of family background and origins. More important than that is your personality traits. Now, if we viewed these as set in stone, it's maybe not a particularly inspiring picture, but because I think there's increasing recognition that they are malleable to a significant degree, I think this is, motivating because we can work on our personality traits to our benefit in terms of our health and our careers as well. Now, we often think of personality maybe as slightly abstract. We talk about extroverts, introverts, and warriors, and laid-back dudes, and so on, and it's all kind of fairly superficial and abstract, maybe. But again, what has been unfolding over recent years is this realization that personality traits actually, they kind of get under the skin, so to speak. They correlate with very many physiological variables. So to give you an idea, for example, trait conscientiousness, I'm going to tell you about the different traits in more detail in a minute, but one of them called conscientiousness correlates strongly with cortisol levels. Cortisol is a stress hormone. In the past, it's been very difficult to link with personality because cortisol fluctuates so much during the day and from one day to the next. But there's a new technique that's come along, which is measuring cortisol buildup in the hair. So for a study, it just came out literally a few months ago. The researchers, they snipped off 3 centimeters of hair from about 2,000 participants, and they measured the cortisol in it, and it gave them a reading of cortisol buildup over the last 3 months. And they found that it correlated very strongly with people's trait conscientiousness. And it did so even after factoring out health behaviors and things, because people who are very conscientious tend not to smoke, tend not to drink, and so on. And but crucially, conscientiousness correlated with this even after factoring out those kind of behaviors, which implies people with conscientious personalities are less, at a physiological level, less susceptible to stress. Your personality also correlates with your immune system function. So researchers have looked at proteins in the body. One of them is C-reactive protein, which are a marker of chronic inflammation. So we need those proteins, and we need our immune system, obviously, to fight illness. But if you have like a chronic immune reaction, this is associated with illnesses, autoimmune illnesses, and over time, it's harmful. People who score highly in trait neuroticism, so they are emotionally unstable, they have mood swings and so on, they show more evidence of chronic inflammation in their bodies. Neuroticism and conscientiousness also correlate with microbacteria in the gut. You've probably heard about, we have like good and bad bacteria in the gut. So high neuroticism correlates with having unhealthy bacteria in the gut, conscientiousness with the healthier kind. Of course, there's a cause and effect issue here. So an obvious point is how do we, is it, for example, is it having unhealthy bacteria that affects your personality, or is it having a certain kind of personality affects the microbacteria in your gut? Psychologists and other scientists are still figuring out, this interplay. It's probably two-way. Heart rate and blood pressure as well. We don't worry too much about our cortisol levels in our hair and so on, but we're more familiar with things like heart rate, blood pressure. Again, neuroticism correlates with high blood pressure. And with heart rate, there's a curious link with having a kind of more antisocial, aggressive personality type correlates with having lower heart rate, lower resting heart rate. So, that's usually seen as a healthy thing. Athletes have low resting heart rates. But there is this curious link that people with these kind of very sort of antisocial, aggressive personalities also have low resting heart rates. And one theory is that it's having that kind of low, very low level, kind of baseline arousal levels that maybe one reason they act out, aggressively and impetuously and so on is because they've got this, they've got this craving for excitement and action and so on. And finally, personality correlates as well with different aspects of brain structure and function. So just to give you one or two examples, conscientiousness, a study came out just this year linking conscientiousness with a larger cortical volume in several brain areas. And there's other research like on brain function that shows, for example, people scoring high in trait neuroticism, their brain at a neural level, they show greater sensitivity to negative stimuli, like unpleasant pictures, or, for example, or unpleasant words. If you have a highly neurotic personality, that shows up at a level of your brain activity as well when you're exposed to unpleasant things. So hopefully I've convinced you a little bit that personality is important for your future, for the lives we have, and that it's closely related to our bodies and our health. I'm just going to tell you a little bit now about what these 5 main traits are, personality traits. Of course, there are many, many, many ways of describing each other and our characters and personalities. In fact, back in the 1930s, Gordon Allport, he's one of the founding fathers of personality psychology. He set out on a mission to uncover all the words in the English language that pertain to describing each other. And he found over 4,000 of these words, an exhaustive list. Some of them are quite strange, like boggish, for example, or there's some weird ones. I don't know what they mean. Gritty. Oh no, I suppose we know what gritty means. I don't know what a greasehorn is. Doesn't sound too good. I like blushful. I think I've definitely been blushful in the past when I was a teenager anyway. So he found over 4,000, and obviously it's completely unwieldy to try and, how to digest that down into a usable model of personality. But thankfully, over the last few decades, that's what personality psychologists have done. They've basically they've weeded out all the redundancy. So they've looked, so whenever 2 adjectives or 2 characteristics correlate very tightly, they've subsumed them under the same heading. And they've done that over and over and over with something called factor analysis. And they've arrived upon 5 main traits, the so-called Big 5, which is pretty much a consensus now in personality psychology that is the reliable model, that these are the 5 traits that our personalities coalesce around. And something that's appealing about it is that it's like a data-driven theory. It comes from looking at correlations between people's scores. It's not like a theory that someone's had about, I think this is how personality works and I'm going to try and look for evidence for it. The Big 5 theory comes from the data. So the first trait is, and these are dimensions as well, I should say. It's so we all lie somewhere on these 5 dimensions. And the first, extroversion, introversion, probably the one we're most familiar with because we talk so much about extroverts and introverts in everyday life. In personality psychology, it is very similar to the lay understanding. It's on a questionnaire, either the questions that tap your extroversion, introversion are things like, do you like chatting to strangers? But it's a bit more than how outgoing you are. In personality psychology, it's also how active you are. It's how much you are attracted to reward and driven to take risks and so on. So it's a bit more than just being sociable and so on. The pros of being an extrovert are, there's lots of evidence suggests extroverts are happier in their lives, higher scorers in extroversion. There are some cons though. So high scorers in extroversion tend to have more alcohol and drug problems. They're more likely to have extramarital affairs, things like that, because they're more drawn to rewards. In excess, it can lead to these kind of problems. There was a recent study that asked, a British study that asked mothers, expectant mothers, if they could choose one trait that they could boost their children's, their child to be. If they could boost their child in one personality trait, which one would they choose? And the British mothers they actually chose extroversion. Maybe because we see extroverts, maybe we recognize that they tend to be happier. Who knows? I mean, the mothers obviously were not up to speed on all the literature for the different traits, but instinctively, this is what they felt would be most beneficial to their children. Trait conscientiousness is things like, as I mentioned, how healthily you live. It's how self-disciplined you are, how much you are able to resist immediate reward for the sake of longer-term aims. How much self-control you have. It's about orderliness. It's also about industriousness and how ambitious. So highly conscientious people tend to be more ambitious and more goal-driven. On a questionnaire, a typical question tapping this trait might be, do you take care of your appearance? As we heard earlier, conscientiousness very strongly correlates with future health, even risk of dying, very strongly. It's also linked, it's one of the most strongly correlated factors in psychology with occupational success and salary and promotion and things like that. But in taken to the extreme, it's not without downsides. Conscientious people, taken to the extreme, can become perhaps too rigid, maybe too conformist. It can lead, in some cases maybe to unhealthy perfectionism. Okay, third trait dimension is neuroticism at one end, emotional stability on the other. Another word for it could be like resilience. So if you score low in neuroticism, then you are more resilient. People who score highly in neuroticism are, it's like they're more sensitive to negative emotions. And they worry more, they're more pessimistic. They are less predictable, more erratic and more impulsive. On a questionnaire, a typical statement, a neurotic person would agree with is that they worry a lot. There are many, many cons, unfortunately, with scoring high on neuroticism. It's linked with poorer mental and physical health, relationship breakups, and so on. Not really that surprising when you think of like the vulnerability to stress and being unpredictable in your behavior is difficult for relationships. Pros, it's not that easy to think of pros for scoring high in neuroticism, but these days personality psychologists tend to take like an evolutionary psychology perspective on personality. So each of the traits, one way to think about them is almost like thermostatic settings for each of these dimensions. And each of us varies in the kind of level that we find comfortable. So with extroversion, introversion, it's the amount of sort of stimulation and excitement that we find comfortable. That's our setting. With this, it's how much we can tolerate of uncertainty and bad things happening and bad moods. Conscientiousness, how much disorder we can cope with or find comfortable, and so on. So we have all these, if you imagine them as like dials that we all have different settings for. And from an evolutionary psychology perspective, there's an advantage, there's a niche for all these different settings in a way. And you can imagine, especially in the past, in our ancestral past, when dangers lurked more immediately around every corner and so on, and more competition for food and mates, then actually being a warrior, being very vigilant, being very sensitive to potential negative outcomes could have been advantageous. And even if from a group, if you think of a group setting as well, there are advantages to having somebody on the group who is on the lookout, who is very vigilant. There's this theory, like a sentinel theory, that some people who are more emotionally sensitive, they can be a boon in some situations. They can be the whistleblower. So maybe, to be fair to high scorers in neuroticism, they can be very beneficial in some circumstances. Now, quite a few surveys have been done now around the world about if you could change your personality in some way on one of the 5 traits, which one would you most like to change on? And this is the one. So whereas mothers said for their children they'd most like to change extroversion, when we're asked ourselves which would we most like to change, this is the one and around the world too. They've done studies not just in Europe and America, but in the Middle East and China, and people want to be less neurotic, more emotionally stable. So the fourth trait, agreeableness. This is it's kind of how warm and friendly you are, but also how trusting you are of others, how much empathy. People who score highly in this have more empathy, find it easier to take other people's perspective. Again, typical questionnaire question. People scoring high in agreeableness tend to be popular. People like this who score highly are they're very good at like instinctively avoiding situations that are going to make them feel bad. They tend to avoid conflict naturally. You know, it comes to them naturally to do that, and that sort of feeds back and helps them. It's easier to be agreeable if you are not in stressful conflict situations. On the disadvantage side, high scorers in agreeableness tend not to do so well in their careers, especially highly competitive dog-eat-dog kind of careers, because if you are, too sensitive to other people's interests, then sometimes it can be hard to get ahead. So depending on what your goals are in life, actually agreeableness is not always advantageous. I've put Anthony Joshua here because for my book about personality change, I've been keeping my eyes open for people with stories, of change, whose personality seem to have changed in their lives. And I don't know how much you know about Anthony Joshua, the heavyweight boxing champion. He started off as a teenager. He was in a lot of trouble with the police and getting into fights, and he was arrested for drug possession. Today, although he's a boxer, which I know is a violent sport, he is actually held up as a role model of civility and respect. He conducts himself, very admirably. He's very charismatic and seems to be very caring. And he said in a recent interview, I could have gone the other way, but I chose respect. So he's one of the individuals I've been keeping my eye on who seems to have changed his personality somewhat, I would say. I'm sure he would score high in agreeableness now, but when he was a teenager, I'm sure if you had met him, you would think the opposite. You would think he was a lot of trouble and someone to avoid, probably. Finally, on the big five is the trait openness to experience, which is all about, so high scorers, they like new things. They like new ideas. They like change. They are more into aesthetics. They're more aesthetically sensitive and cultural. They love opera and poetry and reading and so on. There's some really intriguing studies around the physiological correlates of open-mindedness. So people who score highly in this trait are more prone to goosebumps when they hear, if they hear a beautiful piece of music or what have you. And the other things too, if there's time later, I might go into some of the other new things. Some seriously important pros for this one. So some recent studies show that people scoring high in openness to experience are actually less vulnerable to dementia. On the disadvantage side, taken too far, so people who score highly are very imaginative, free thinking. Taken too far in the extreme, it can become seeing things that aren't there. Can even slip into delusions and psychiatrists would call it kind of schizotypic thinking or schizotypic personality. Now, some of those descriptions are a bit dry and a bit abstract. So something psychologists have been doing recently is trying to look at what are the everyday behaviors that correlate with those big five traits. And this study came out last year, and they looked at, I think it was 800 people in Oregon. They measured their personality traits. Then they caught up with them again several years later. They gave them a list of 400, it was a really exhaustive list, 400 different kind of all weird and wonderful everyday behaviors. And they asked them how many times, how frequently they engage in these behaviors. And then they looked for correlations with the big scores on the big 5 traits. And they uncovered some fairly quirky links. So strong extroverts, for example, said they spent more time in hot tubs. They spend more time getting like on sunbeds. They spend more time, I don't know why, talking on the phone about money. Because this list of 400 had some weird things on there. Yeah, they're more likely as well. They confess to more often driving and talking on the phone at the same time. Highly conscientious people, they less often chewed their pencil, they said. They swear less often. More likely to wear a watch, which makes sense because conscientious people don't want to be late. Probably one of the most obvious signs of being highly conscientious is that you're punctual and an early riser. High scorers in neuroticism, as you might expect, they said they lost their temper more often. Not that surprising. They said they more likely to say they took antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. Highly agreeable people, they said they more often spent time doing chores, the washing up and ironing. And the theory here is that highly agreeable people, because they're doing things that will benefit others. So that's why they are tidying up, doing the tidying up. They also, high scorers in agreeability, said they spent more time singing in the shower. I got no idea why that would correlate. This is open-mindedness. So open-minded people, lots of the correlations were as you would expect. More time going to the opera, more likely to smoke cannabis, and so on. But they also said they spent more time walking around their house with no clothes on. I guess it's an open-minded thing to do. Something I didn't mention earlier is that open-mindedness also correlates with political orientation very strongly. So more liberal-leaning, left-leaning people tend to score higher on open-mindedness, and the more kind of right-leaning and conservative you are, then you tend to score lower on open-mindedness. How are we doing? Now, some people say those big 5 traits don't explain the entirety of human personality. They believe there is a dark side too that's not fully tapped into by these 5. So there is also, although it's a little bit controversial, the so-called dark triad of traits, which you may have heard of. And the first of these is narcissism, which maybe used to be a more obscure concept in psychology, not so much since Donald Trump came along, because you may have seen articles, kind of describing him as having a narcissistic personality. Psychologists are not really supposed to comment on, public figures who they haven't actually met, and so on. It's kind of frowned upon, but there are some psychologists and psychiatrists in the States who have actually signed a kind of a group letter saying that they think in this case the usual rule should be broken because it is such a serious issue. So people who with narcissistic personalities, they tend to be, goes without saying, they seem very vain, they're very obsessed with their reputation. They seem to turn everything around to be about themselves. Their conversation is all about themselves. They're very, very sensitive to criticism. They're more concerned about what people think about them than anything else. There's some really intriguing studies because on the surface they can seem full of bravado, big-headed, overflowing with confidence. But some really intriguing studies suggest that it's really a kind of a compensation for deep-seated insecurity. For example, there's a brain imaging study that asked people to look at themselves in the mirror, and people scoring highly in trait neuroticism actually showed more brain activity in areas related to feeling negative emotion. So you might think narcissists would love looking at themselves. They showed the opposite. Another paper it involves students playing this kind of online computer game where they had to collaborate with others, passing a ball backwards and forwards with other people. And sometimes the researchers made it so that the participant was ignored by the other players, kind of rejected. Now, the adolescent, I think they were students, participants who scored highly in narcissism said they weren't bothered by this at all when they were rejected. But their brain activity showed the opposite, showed more signs of negative emotion and hurt and so on. Again, all these things kind of pointing that there's actually underneath the veneer of big-headedness is this sort of vulnerability underneath. Second, the dark triad traits, psychopathy. And this is associated with, it's like this mixture of superficial charm. When you first meet a psychopath, you know, they usually can seem, they score very high in extroversion, psychopaths usually. So they can seem, you know, incredibly affable and engaging to talk to. But it's combined with this callousness. They don't care, or they seem not to care at all for others. You know, incredibly low agreeability, on trait agreeability. Something, a couple of interesting things have developed the last few years is there's increasing focus on something called this concept of successful psychopaths or successful psychopathy. Because we usually think of psychopaths, you know, as being like serial killers or they're locked up in prison. There's increasing recognition that actually a lot of psychopathy doesn't have to go hand in hand with that violence and aggression. And actually some real high flyers, you know, chief executives, in some cases, like surgeons, and you can imagine also special forces, soldiers. They score highly on some of these psychopathy questionnaires, especially this subtrait called fearless dominance, which is a key aspect of psychopathy. Fearless dominance is like, it's almost like extreme lack of neuroticism, you know, or extreme emotional stability. It's like they have ice running through their veins, which when a violent, nasty person has that characteristic, you can imagine it leads them to commit crimes. But imagine you're not violent and you're not particularly aggressive, but you still have this ice running through your veins, then it can be a huge advantage for high stakes careers. So like you imagine like brain surgery or running a multinational corporation. So there's kind of increasing recognition of that there are sort of psychopaths in a sense walking among us. The other thing that's emerged recently is that because psychopaths are very callous, there was this idea that they're incapable of feeling empathy. New studies coming out suggest actually they can experience empathy, they can take other people's perspective. It's just that doesn't kick in automatically for them. So for most of us, it's something we kind of do automatically when we meet other people or we hear about other people. You know, we, to a certain extent, we feel for them, we take their perspective. Psychopaths don't do that, but these new studies show that if they're motivated, if you instruct them to and you give them good reason to, then they can. It's all about motivating them to make that effort, and this is important for potential rehabilitation. I suppose if you can show the psychopath that it's in their interest to take other people's perspective in a beneficial way for everyone rather than just for them, then it's a potential route to rehabilitation. The final dark triad trait is Machiavellianism. And this is the least studied and the sort of least understood of the dark triad. People like this, they see other people as pawns. They manipulate other people. They see nothing wrong with manipulating other people for their own ends. And they're happy to lie and cheat as well, which they do frequently. you might think it sounds similar to psychopathy, and maybe even psychopathy sounds a little bit like narcissism, like there's this self-centeredness to all of them. And actually, some critics of the dark triad kind of theory say they're really all tapping into something very similar. And there's a rival, sort of like a rival model called the hexaco model of personality, which alongside the big 5 traits envisages a 6th trait, which is the honesty and humility dimension. So proponents of that hexaco model, they say this dark triad is really all captured by this 6th trait of honesty and humility. And, I think there's probably a lot of something in that, because, you find, lots of people, for example, with Trump, he's often accused not only of being narcissistic, but for lacking empathy, for example, which would go with this one, and for manipulating others, which would go with the Machiavellianism. So there is a lot of overlap. How am I doing? Okay. So hopefully you've got an idea now of what personality is, at least according to modern personality psychologists, the traits that tend to get measured and that are considered important. Personality also predicts these outcomes in life. And there is an element of stability, but I want to show you now that it's not destiny, it's not fixed, like William James said, from age 30. It's fluid throughout life. So one study I'm going to tell you about, if you just imagine for a second your classmates when you were a teenager at school and you were going to go to a reunion in your 70s, do you think you would see something of their old personality all those decades later? Or would they have transformed totally, the people you knew? Effectively, that's what this study came out a couple of years ago. That's what they did. They found this data from the 1940s, these teenagers who took these personality tests and had their personalities rated by their teachers when they were age 14, and they managed to catch up with hundreds of them again 63 years later. And they had them take exactly the same personality test, and they had them nominate a friend or a relative to also rate them on that same personality test. And believe it or not, there was no correlation between the two. They scored completely differently. Now they're age 77 than they scored when they were age 14. There is a caveat to this. Well, there could be a few, but the most important one is it was a very limited personality test. It wasn't like a thorough test of all the different personality traits. It was mainly focused on sort of conscientiousness-like aspects of personality. But nonetheless, I think it's a good recent example of the change that can happen across a lifetime. It was the longest study that's ever been done in comparing across such a long time span. Second piece of evidence I'd like to show you is from the field of psychotherapy. So normally psychotherapy research, it focuses on changes in symptoms. Normally, obviously, it makes sense. Have you decreased in your depression symptoms or anxiety symptoms or whatever it might be? This is Brent Roberts again, who I mentioned earlier, a paper by him from last year. What he and his colleagues realized is a lot of clinical psychology and psychotherapy studies, almost sort of incidentally sometimes, they have measured personality traits as well, not just symptoms. So they looked through the whole literature, like the whole psychotherapy literature, looking for studies and trials where personality had been measured. And they looked to see whether personality changes before therapy compared with after therapy. And to their surprise, to some extent, considering how sort of fixed many people had said personality is, they found that actually as little as 4 weeks of therapy led to significant changes in personality traits, especially reduced trait neuroticism and increased extroversion. And it didn't seem to matter what kind of therapy, CBT or psychodynamic psychotherapy, it didn't seem to matter. In fact, the amount of change in trait neuroticism that they found after a few weeks of therapy was about half as much of the change in neuroticism that you typically see across a lifetime happened in after just 4 weeks, or roughly 4 weeks of therapy. And the changes, some studies followed up, over a long period of time, and these changes seem to be stable. People didn't regress back to their pre-therapy trait levels. There seemed to be lasting change. Now, also, our personalities don't just change through life or after therapy. Our personalities also change from one situation to the next. This actually taps into a big debate in psychology, personality psychology, that went on for decades. This kind of clash between the situationists and the trait theorists. People like Walter Mischel, who you may have heard of, who's famous for the marshmallow experiment. He presented this evidence that suggested far more important than the traits we have for explaining behavior is a particular situation. People like Zimbardo, in his famous Stanford prison experiment, again, where he claimed, if you create a certain strong enough situation, the situation overwhelms people's personality. So in the Stanford prison experiment, the idea was that volunteers who played the role of guard started acting in a tyrannical way. Didn't matter what their personality type was. So this led some to claim that personality as such is a myth. Now things have moved on, and there is really an emerging consensus that both matter. Personality traits matter, situation matters. It kind of depends partly on the time scale that you're looking at. This graph shows you that how much our personalities, each individual's personality changes across different situations, on average, is bigger than how much one person varies from another in their personality. Which, if you think about it, makes sense because, for example, if you are studying in the library on your own, very difficult to have an extroverted personality in that situation, for example. If you guys took personality tests now, Sunday morning you are in a lecture theatre, maybe taking notes or whatever, paying attention, you'll probably score very high on conscientiousness in this moment. So it makes sense that there are these situational changes. But that doesn't mean personality is a myth, because personality comes into play when you average over extended periods of time. Because if you measure the personality of a strong extrovert lots of times over a week, it will come out in the wash that on average they are more sociable, more risk-seeking, and so on, than an introvert. And this graph sort of shows this stability over time in our traits. So if you measure average extroversion across a whole week, it will correlate very strongly with average extroversion in the second week. So to understand behavior, we need to look at situational influences and appreciate our long-term habits of thinking and behaving, which is our traits as well. But there is a dynamic between the two. And I think recognizing that is very important for deliberate personality change, which I will get onto later. I think better appreciating situational influences on our personalities and the jobs we do, the hobbies we have, the people we mix with, and how that influences our trait-like behavior in the moment, and how that can accumulate. So you can imagine how that can accumulate and snowball over time. Okay. Those graphs come from this paper. So if you are interested in this debate between sort of situationist accounts of behavior versus personality traits, it's quite a few years old now, this paper, but I think it's a really good sort of introduction. Oh, sorry. because I'm, writing this book about personality change and personality dynamics and development, one thing I've got interested in is how situations change our personality traits, even in, if it is just in the short term. And this study came along recently from last year, and they recruited loads of students, and for 2 weeks they asked them to record, they quizzed them multiple times, gave them lots of these surveys multiple times through the day over 2 weeks, and they asked them what they were doing. They took a little mini personality test. They crucially they reported their mood, how they were feeling, their emotions. And what I think is really interesting is, so people's personality traits did vary from situation to situation, as we've just discussed. But it nearly entirely was explained by their mood, how their mood was different in different situations. So when the students were feeling, whatever they were doing, if it made them feel happier, more positive emotion, then they tended on the personality test to score higher on extroversion and open-mindedness. When they were feeling down or sad emotions, whatever they were doing, whatever it was they were doing that was causing them to feel that way, then they tended to score higher on neuroticism and lower on agreeability. When they were studying, they scored lower when the students were studying on extroversion, lower on agreeability, higher on neuroticism, and lower on openness as well. But they scored higher in conscientiousness. That was the one redeeming feature. So you can see the things that you do and how the things you do make you feel, at least in the moment, brings out, enhances or amplifies different aspects of our personalities in the moment. And that's something I'm going to come back to in the second half when I look at perhaps ways we can deliberately go about changing our personalities and or bringing out the best in ourselves, at least. Okay, so I think now's a good time to take a 5-minute break, and while we have this, I'm just going to I would like you to take a look at these 4 questions. Are these legs shiny? You have to answer. What color is this dress? You may have seen this famous dress before. There's like a riddle here for you to read and see if you can come up with an explanation. And finally, I want you to think about did you know that it's almost impossible to lick your own elbow? And so we just take 5 minutes. Who thought the legs are shiny? Yes. Actually, they've just got paint on them. So I'm stretching things a bit, but I think this might be a simple test of open-mindedness, because if you score higher on open-mindedness, you're more likely to think of contextual factors that could be explaining these white marks. And you might, if you're very observant, have noticed like the hint of art materials here, which is where this paint has come from.
Which answer is open-minded?
If you realize that it's paint on the legs. Don't take these too seriously. This is kind of pseudo-scientific. So with the dress, who thought the dress is gold and white? A few, about a third or a fifth maybe. Who thought blue and black? Yeah, much more, majority of you. And who thought there is no correct answer? Oh, a smattering, yeah. Okay, in fact, the dress is blue and black. You might have seen this. It was like a big sort of viral meme a couple of years back. So the dress is actually blue and black. It's overexposed image, and it seems to trick the brains of some of us into seeing it as gold and white. I confess I see it as gold and white, even though I know it's blue and black. I can only see it as gold and white. I can't make myself see it as blue and black. It might sound a bit self-serving, but I found this brain imaging paper about a year ago that asked people to look at this dress in a brain. They were lying in a brain scanner, looked at this dress, and people who saw it as gold and white showed greater brain activity in like visual areas and association areas of their brain, suggesting they were working harder to interpret the image, more like what cognitive psychologists call top-down processing, rather than bottom-up, stimulus-driven. So in a way that you could see that as correlating with open-mindedness again, because it is being more creative and not going purely on what is in front of you, but also bringing your own interpretation. That would be the gold and white, even though it's wrong. So, maybe I just cherry-picked that paper because I'm biased because I see it as gold and white. Another paper looked for correlations between people's answers and optimism, and they found that people who answer C tend to be more optimistic, which optimism correlates with different personalities, a few of the personality traits, especially conscientiousness. Highly conscientious people tend to be more optimistic. And so if you thought there was no correct answer, the idea is that people who are optimistic are happier with uncertainty. You know, that they don't find uncertainty uncomfortable because they're optimists. So that's why that's the thinking anyway with that one. So this one, at her mother's funeral, a woman falls in love with a man there who she'd never met before. After the funeral, she had no way to track him down. A short time later, she killed her sister. Did any of you have any idea why she may have killed her sister? Yeah, go ahead.
I reckon it's inheritance, baseline fallacy. Most murders are either sex or money. Her mother's just died.
That's good thinking.
The whole man and love thing is irrelevant. It's an irrelevant detail.
I like your thinking. This is another one of these kind of viral memes that went gone around the internet a few times. The idea is if you answer that she killed her sister so as to set up another funeral, in the hope that the man comes back. Yeah.
Her sister was the one dressed up as a man.
The idea is, if you... Where's my pointer thingy gone? Yeah. The idea is if you answered that, if you thought that way, in that cunning way to create another funeral to get the man back, then you are a psychopath. That's the idea. So I don't know if any of you came up with that idea, but don't worry if you did, actually, because Kevin Dutton, who wrote The Wisdom of Psychopaths, he went into prisons and he actually gave this little riddle to people who are kind of diagnosed in psychopathy, and they did it. They were no more likely to come up with that answer. So it's not really a diagnosis of psychopathy. It's really just a fun riddle. There is another, not for psychopathy, but for narcissism. I was meant to put that up just now. There's a very simple way to measure narcissism, apparently. This is a very recent paper. If you ask someone, to what extent do you agree with this statement, I am a narcissist, and you add the explanation, note the word narcissist means egotistical, self-focused and vain, narcissists are more likely to agree strongly. And this study found that their agreement with that simple statement correlates very strongly with a 40-item narcissism inventory. So if you want to know if someone is a narcissist, just ask them this. Test them on this simple statement, and it seems to correlate very well with an in-depth measure. And the theory here is that narcissists, presented with this explanation, narcissists just see this as another way of seeming special, which they like. And the researchers noted that it's I am a narcissist, like a kind of special identity, not narcissistic, which could be considered, an insult, I suppose. So Oh, so with the, did you know that you can lick your own elbow or not? I borrowed this from Brian Little, a personality psychologist in the USA, who's written some great books on personality. And the idea here is that if you're very conscientious, you probably Googled it already to find out if it is true, that you can lick your own elbow. Or maybe you even made a note in your diary to look it up later. If you're a high scorer in neuroticism, you probably didn't like to give it a go and you thought it's just another example of how you have failed in life. If you're a high scorer in agreeableness, you probably, you thought about it and you might have had a go just because you're an easygoing kind of person who likes to go along with things. If you're a high scorer in extroversion, if you're a strong extrovert, yes, you probably tried. You probably tried not just with your elbow, but with the person sitting next to you as well. So that's from Brian Little. This one doesn't tell you anything about personality, I don't think, but I just found it the other day. Greg Caruso, psychologist on Twitter, and I just thought it was really cool. Can you see the guy wearing the white jeans and heels? But can you also see it the other way? Because actually the man is sitting in the chair, and you can sometimes flip it back and forth between the two. I mean, it might correlate with open-mindedness if you can switch backwards and forwards really quickly. But don't quote me on that. Someone just saw it the other way. Okay, so I'm going to use the rest of the time I have. I'll leave some time for questions at the end. And for as much time as I have, I'm going to tell you a bit about how personality changes through life and how maybe we can deliberately change our personalities too. So there is something called the maturity principle when you look at personality development through the lifespan. So unlike the old idea that personality stops changing age 30, we know it changes through life. There is a thread of continuity, like I mentioned before. But it also changes on average. This is averaging across lots of people. How do our personality traits tend to change on average? Not everyone conforms to the average, but on average, we tend, as we get older, to become less extrovert as we get older, but we get more agreeable. We go down in open-mindedness as we get older, on average. Our neuroticism goes down as we get older. It's a good thing. We get more emotionally stable, tend to, as we get older.
Sometimes in a crisis.
Pardon?
Sometimes in a crisis.
Yes. So in a crisis, which you're going to hear more about later, I think, from later speaker, you'll find this is across the life path. This is looking at not sort of specific events. This is looking at the whole, across decades, what happens on average when you average lots and lots of people, rather than looking at any sort of individual response to a particular event. Conscientiousness tends to rise up to around midlife, and then it drops off again and goes down. Some people describe that, so in older age, there's this phenomenon called the La Dolce Vita, if I've said that right, effect, the sweet, which means sweet life. The idea being that when we get older and we have fewer responsibilities, we start to go down on conscientiousness because we don't have so many worries in life anymore. In adolescence, so although there's those general curves, patterns I just described, in adolescence there's something called the disruption hypothesis. So although personality tends to increase in stability into young adulthood and beyond, there's like this period of regression in adolescence, early adolescence especially, where you see increases in neuroticism and lower conscientiousness, which kind of fits, maybe our intuitions about what, teenage years are difficult with all the changes. So those are the trends, that come out when you look at sort of at a population level. Another effect you find through life is this. Do you remember me telling you about my friend at school, the butter chucker, and how he seemed to grow in conscientiousness when he was given a role, an important social role, which he was committed to? So that's social investment theory, and some studies have looked at this. So this one is from Germany, and they compared young people who after school, they went into either community service, they could choose, either into community service or military service. And you can see that those that went into military service, they sort of flatlined on trait agreeability. Those who went into community service, they showed this increase in agreeableness. And so it's an example of how the roles that we select, in some cases for ourselves, shapes our personality over time. Because you can imagine doing community service, it is advantageous to be agreeable, have empathy, and so on. If you are in military service, those traits, aspects of character are not so useful. So it seems to be shaping character over time. This one is sort of a more general look at investment in work. So this is an aspect of social investment in work. People who said they agreed, for example, that they felt very strongly obligated to their work, to their job, to their role at work. Over time, this is a period, I think, of 2.5 years. People who had those feelings towards their job are feeling duty-bound and committed and motivated. Over time, they increase in trait conscientiousness over the years. The group with the least investment in their job role, they show declines in conscientiousness. So this is something to think about, with the roles that you take on in life, can shape your personality. If you're in a job that you don't enjoy, it doesn't mean anything to you, it won't be a surprise that you find it hard to keep to your deadlines, arrive punctually and so on. It's going to shape your personality over periods of time. On the other hand, if you can find roles that you care about, that mean something to you, that resonate with your personal values, it doesn't have to be paid job, it could be, a hobby or volunteer work. If you find a niche or a role like that, that does mean something to you, you're more likely to start behaving and thinking and developing in a way that's going to boost your conscientiousness. Of course, there are big events and experiences in life, and they seem to shape our personalities too. There's research on how getting married changes personality. Might be of interest to this couple. There's a bit of a cliche. I don't know if you remember that scene in Bridget Jones' Diary where she's at a dinner party and she's the only singleton, and she looks around the table at all these married couples and they all seem really sort of boring and closed-minded. Long-term studies that have followed people, measured their personality at one time point, then measured it again later and compared those who got married with those who didn't. Somewhat following the stereotype, people who got married show declines in extroversion, and they go down in open-mindedness as well. So sort of fulfilling that stereotype of people settling down and perhaps becoming a bit less exciting maybe in their personalities. On the plus side, another paper looked at forgiveness and self-control, measured those aspects of personality before, then in newlyweds, then followed them up for a couple of years afterwards, and they found both increased in people who got married. Self-control increased and forgiveness increased in people who got married. In fact, as much, these were modest effects, but the increase in self-control was as much as you see in interventions that are specifically designed to boost people's self-control. So anyone who is married might resonate with them, the need for self-control and forgiveness. I don't know. Researchers have looked at this, the idea of people who are married becoming more and more like each other over time. In fact, people who have been married longer are no more similar in their personalities than people who have been married short periods of time. So the research doesn't seem to back up that idea that we become like our spouses in personality. Having said that, there is something called the Michelangelo phenomenon, which is about the fact that when we have a partner or close friend or partner who has the traits, personality traits that we aspire to, it makes it easier for us to change ourselves in that direction. They seem to serve as a model for us. So in that specific case, it's called the Michelangelo phenomenon, the idea being that the partner, the spouse, helps sculpt you to become your ideal self if they have those traits that you aspire to. So again, that's something to think about, not just the social roles you take on, but the people, the close, meaningful people that you mix with. If they have the kind of traits you aspire to and the values that you have, that's going to help you develop in that way. Breakups, researchers have studied this too, changes in personality after divorce. And there's a gender difference has come up in some of this research. So men after divorce seem to show dips in, increase in neuroticism and dips in conscientiousness after divorce. Researchers said they seem to have taken it as demoralizing experience. For women after divorce, the same studies found increased extroversion and open-mindedness in women after divorce, as if they found it a liberating experience. So I don't make any comment on that. One of the biggest things, obviously, or maybe the biggest thing that can ever happen to any of us is to have children. And this one is a bit of a puzzle for personality researchers because of that social investment theory that I have mentioned a few times. You would think of all the roles, like social roles you could take on in life, becoming a parent, the most meaningful and dramatic of all. You would think, based on social investment theory, you would see these big upticks in conscientiousness after becoming a parent. In fact, that isn't coming out in the studies. And if anything, this study came out, so it's looking at self-esteem. So it's not one of the big 5 traits, but self-esteem is related to a few of the, extroverts tend to have higher self-esteem, and low neuroticism would go with higher self-esteem. And these mothers, it was 80,000 Norwegian mothers, this study. And when they were pregnant, they showed increases in self-esteem. But soon after giving birth, they showed a 3-year dip in their self-esteem. So not at all what we would think from social investment theory seemed to be a harmful effect on personality. We still don't fully know why, but it's easy to speculate. One thing is social investment theory, those benefits to conscientiousness and so on from a meaningful role that matters so much to you. The idea is that that works because you get very clear feedback when you get very clear feedback about what is demanded of you, and you're motivated to meet those demands. That leads to beneficial changes. The thing with parenting is, so the possible explanation goes, is that it's very confusing. There's so much advice, a lot of it contradictory out there about how to be a good parent, how you should behave when you're a parent. So it's all very confusing. You're not getting that clear feedback, and add to that sleep deprivation, judgments from others about whether you're a good parent or not, and then starts to make sense why you get this dip in self-esteem. Unpleasant experience to lose our jobs. Researchers have looked at personality changes after this, and again, they found a gender difference. So men, after losing their job, they have shown a temporary increase in agreeableness, which is perhaps a reaction to their new status, and they're trying to compensate by being warmer, friendlier. But over time, if they stay unemployed, men tend to show this lasting dip in conscientiousness, trait conscientiousness, which is a worrying trend because lower conscientiousness is going to make it harder to get a new job. So you've got a bit of a negative feedback loop here. But knowing that, there are things you could do to besides getting another job, there are things you could do to try and enhance your conscientiousness, to try and break that negative feedback loop through volunteer work or whatever it might be, starting a new hobby or what have you that requires dedication from you could keep your conscientiousness levels higher. Among women, they show initial declines after losing their job in conscientiousness and agreeableness. But unlike the men, the research showed over time women bounced back. Even if they stayed unemployed, they bounced back and their conscientiousness rebounded. And it's bound to be slightly controversial, but the research has speculated that's because even today, with our traditional sort of gender norms around the genders, it's easier perhaps for women to find a niche social roles outside of work. That was the speculation. So they find meaning and roles that they can fill outside of work that then benefit their personality development again. So that's all very passive. You know, those are things kind of happening to us. Those are some of the trends that you see in big events in life and how they shape personality. For this book I'm writing, I've got interested in recognizing the malleability of personality and how it continues to change through life. It's made me more interested, maybe look for ways we could tweak deliberately rather than passively waiting for events and relationships to change us. Perhaps we could take deliberate steps to tweak some of these underlying aspects of personality, and then sort of hack into this feedback loop by changing our habits of thought and so on, our ways of relating to others. We can change this dynamic, have more beneficial life experiences, feedback, and help our personality development in a positive way. I think it only needs to be some slight changes. You're not ever going to change because we are restrained to an extent by our genetic endowment. I'm not arguing that you can transform yourself from one extreme, personality extreme to another, but you can definitely make tweaks. And only small changes could have big effects, that snowball. Imagine you change your personality enough that you apply for a job that you wouldn't have done otherwise, or you agree to meet up and go to a party or something that you wouldn't have done otherwise, join a club, a tennis club, or whatever it might be, that you wouldn't have done otherwise if you hadn't have made the small but significant changes to your personality. That can then spiral and snowball hopefully I think in a positive way. I'm not the only one thinking this way. So a couple of years, 3 years ago, this was a New York Times op-ed column. Other people are beginning to recognize the importance of personality traits for life outcomes. Headlines, should schools teach personality? Because there's recognition that it's not just it's not just intelligence and academic skills that are important for a healthy life, successful life. It's personality traits too, and that they are to an extent malleable. Before I get into, so I've been looking recently at interventions that change key aspects of those big 5 traits. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute, but the underlying principles behind this are, if you want to deliberately go about developing your personality, if you just have vague aims, like you want to be more, I would like to be more open-minded, you're unlikely to be successful. It's similar, you can draw an analogy of fitness. If you set a New Year's resolution, I'm going to try and go running more, I'm going to try and get fitter next year. It's unlikely to be successful. You need to make specific commitments. The more specific you can be, the more likely you are to succeed. So rather than committing to being more extroverted, if you, for example, said, you could start quite modest. If you said, once a week at work, rather than sending an email, I'm going to telephone whoever it is, or I'm going to go to their desk. It might not come naturally to you at first. The thing is, this is all about developing new habits, because once things become habitual, then they're essentially becoming part of your personality. With open-mindedness, again, if you just think I want to be more cultural next year, it's not likely to happen. If you make a dedicated commitment, to, for example, I'm going to go to the theatre once a month, make it a commitment, even specify the day and the theatre, whatever. The more specific you can be, more likely you will be successful. That's basically what I just said. You can even do, little tiny tweaks. Maybe if you're kind of slightly, if you're introverted or emotionally sensitive, you don't like human interactions much with strangers, maybe you, for example, always go to the automatic checkout at the shop. You could just make a tweak, like I'm not going to use those anymore. I'm going to use, unless you're in a rush or whatever, I'm going to use the cashier. Force, that human interaction. That's just one tiny tweak, but imagine if you build these up, you could, you don't have to become, a raving, out-and-out party animal type extrovert, but you can make slight tweaks to develop your personality if you want to, which might help you achieve your goals. Like I say, smaller effects can snowball because these things accumulate. By changing our personalities, we change how we behave, and little changes can build up over time. The Sky cycling sports team, they talk about minimal gains. They just make these little tiny tweaks to enhance performance. I think that's a good analogy for this. Bear in mind the situational effects as well, and think about, you don't just bring your personality to the roles and in life that you occupy. They are also shaping you. We don't always have much choice, but maybe we have more choice than we think. And, if you are in a job that you don't find fulfilling, that could be shaping you over time. It might be worth considering making a change. That could have knock-on effects on your personality and then other aspects of your life. Similar story with friends and partners. If you mix with people who leave you in a bad mood, that's going to shape your personality in the moment, and that can accumulate. If you mix with people who make you feel comfortable and leave you in a good mood, that's going to shape your personality in a positive direction. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of effort because, as I mentioned at the beginning, our personality is what we do. By definition, it's how you behave automatically, how you think automatically. So changing that, by definition, is going to take effort. It's going to be uncomfortable at first. Also, you're more likely to succeed in developing your personality if it's in the service of some overarching values or goals. Just having the mission to I just want to change myself for the sake of it, again, is less likely to succeed than if you would like to change yourself in the service of some bigger goal. So if you aspire to a role, a promotion at work that requires that you network more or do public speaking or something, and you currently don't find that comfortable, I think you're more likely to succeed in changing your personality if it is in the service of, if it's towards that larger ambition that you have, rather than being an end in itself, the personality change. Instead, the personality change is towards that goal. Or it could be a more abstract value. Maybe you have you want to get involved in charity work, or you are upset by bad things happening in the community, or that is your goal. You want to help ease suffering, but you're held back by your disposition because you find it hard to mix with others, or you find it hard, or you're disorganized, or you find it hard to juggle work and volunteer work, whatever. Changing your personality in the service of that more sort of overarching value or goal is more likely to succeed, I think, than just changing your personality for its own sake. You've probably heard about growth mindset, the idea that things like intelligence and ability, and to that list we can now add personality, are malleable, they're not set in stone. Merely believing that is going to help you make personality development will be easier for you if you hold that belief. Hopefully I will have convinced you a little bit today, so you might have a start. If you believe a leopard never changes its spots, if you think people cannot ever change, you're going to find it hard to be motivated enough to put the changes in place, behavioural and habitual changes in place to develop your personality. And yeah, it's a bit corny, but I just said it won't be easy again, because this is something to change your personality is going to take, it will take commitment. It'll be uncomfortable probably in many cases at first. It's all about perseverance and changing things that are effortful, doing it, repeating it enough until it becomes habitual and it becomes part of who you are. So I was going to give you an example of a kind of specific technique. These kind of specific techniques you could try for each trait, one for each of the big 5 traits. This chap's meant to be extroverted. It's a bit hard to choose pictures to illustrate. So he's an extrovert. To become more extroverted, you could try something called anxious reappraisal. Very, very simple technique. There was a study a couple of years ago that they tested out. People were about to do a difficult challenge. They had to sing in front of other people. It was a surprise challenge. They had to sing this song. It was embarrassing. Or they had to do some maths tasks under pressure in public. And the researchers coached some of the participants to say to themselves, "I'm feeling excited," beforehand. And the others said, "I'm feeling anxious," or they said nothing. And the researchers found that people who sort of encouraged to interpret their bodily feelings and emotions as excitement rather than anxiety showed less of a stress response when they were doing this public, embarrassing or difficult public challenge. And the idea is that this works because it's better doing that. It's better to sort of tell yourself to think of the sensations as excitement rather than just trying to calm down, because other typical conventional advice would be take deep breaths, try and calm down. But then you're trying to fight against those strong feelings of adrenaline and arousal. It's better to reinterpret that because it's very similar bodily. Excitement and anxiety are very similar at physiological level, so it's better to practice anxious reappraisal. So it's something you could try, because extroverts, that's how they see challenges. They see challenges as an opportunity. And by thinking more in those terms, seeing things more as opportunities rather than threats, seeing it as exciting rather than anxiety-provoking, then you can maybe tweak your personality a little bit toward the extrovert end of the spectrum if you want to. Don't have to, nothing wrong with being introverted, but if you think that might help you achieve your goals, then you could try that. This is meant to be a conscientious person who has to put everything into folders. So something I found interesting here is studies that have tracked people over time and looked at those who managed to achieve their goals and resist temptation and those who don't succeed. What they found is the achievers, they don't have cast iron willpower. Exerting willpower didn't correlate with goal achievement. The high achievers, those who resisted temptations, they actually avoided temptations in the first place. This was one of these studies that gives people prompts on their mobile phone, to record what they're doing, what's happening, whether they're exerting willpower, whether they're resisting a temptation. The goal achievers, the high achievers, it's almost like they recognized human weakness. They had an instinct to recognize that humans have weak willpower. And so the way ahead to conscientiousness is perhaps not about developing that kind of cast iron willpower. Maybe it's about being strategic, not letting yourself face these temptations in the first place. So, for example, it could be something simple like a modern phenomenon meant to be bedtime procrastination. Find it hard to go to sleep on time because we've got the iPad in bed reading Kindles and what have you, and makes us delay going to sleep. It's very difficult to resist temptations, so just maybe set a rule that you don't have those temptations in the bedroom or wherever. Set yourself a rule, treat yourself as fallible, recognize you don't have very good willpower, so I'm not going to let myself have iPads when I'm supposed to be going to sleep or whatever. It's that kind of thing. Or don't choose a route to work, walking to work that doesn't go past the bakery with the delicious muffins in the window. That seems like conscientious people, that's what they do. It's not that they walk past the muffins and are unfazed. They don't go that way, they go a different way. This is meant to be a chilled out, low neuroticism person. And maybe a not so obvious approach to increasing emotional resilience is online memory training exercises. So if you Google N-back tasks, they're these kind of tasks that require that we juggle bits of information in our mind at the same time, numbers or letters. And so it's N-back task. And it seems like what's that got to do with neuroticism? But what researchers have found is that people who practice these kind of tasks, you find them in brain training programs like Lumosity, CogMed, I think is another one. They tend to use these kind of games, exercises that require that you juggle these numbers and letters in your mind. And researchers have found that doing these memory training exercises reduces people's anxiety levels and levels of worry. And they think that's because doing these exercises helps give you more kind of mental control over your own thoughts. Sort of builds up your working memory muscles, which is for juggling, what we pay attention to. So if you harness your working memory through these exercises, then you're less likely to have your mind grabbed by threats or by worrisome thoughts. For boosting agreeability, you could try reading more literary fiction. So a slightly controversial area with some negative replications, but there are a lot of positive studies too that suggest reading fiction boosts empathy and theory of mind, which is a hallmark of scoring high in agreeability. Open-mindedness. You could try doing puzzles like crosswords and Sudoku. So there was a recent trial with older adults that found that a training program that involved these kind of games boosted their open-mindedness at a time of life when open-mindedness tends to be in decline. And one theory here is that because open-mindedness is very much tied up with confidence, and researchers think that completing these games helped the volunteers boost their confidence in their own sort of mental abilities, and that makes it more likely and makes you more willing to try out new things. Also, exercise has been found to link strongly with open-mindedness, and it's probably a similar link, because exercise, it makes you, feeling fitter and stronger. It's going to help you be more open-minded, more open to trying out new things. I'm getting a bit close to running out of time. I just tell you this one quickly. So that's one for each of the big 5 traits. Because neuroticism is the trait that people most want, apparently, to reduce neuroticism, I thought I would just give you one extra one. And this ties in a bit with what I was telling you earlier about situations affecting our moods, which affects our personality. So a study came out this year testing what the researchers called, this was Thomas Webb at University of Sheffield, testing what they called situation selection strategy. So this was the paper, and it's a pretty simple idea. It's just being more conscious of how the things you choose to do, how they make you feel, the different activities and situations that you put yourself in, paying more attention to how that makes you feel. And these researchers found that people who do that more intuitively, who say they pay more attention to how different situations and activities make them feel, they tend to be more emotionally resilient, like the two things go together. People who are more emotionally sensitive, more neurotic, they tend not to think that way. So the researchers then tested, well, maybe if you train people to be more mindful of situation selection. Of course, many situations come upon us without choice, but hopefully many of us do have a fair degree of freedom, and they coached them before a weekend, their participants, they got a whole load of volunteers, they coached them to repeat this to themselves and to commit to it. If I am deciding what to do this weekend, then I will select activities that will make me feel good and avoid doing things that will make me feel bad. They found afterwards, after the weekend was over, they had their volunteers back, and they found that they had those who followed this instruction compared with a control group. They did this. They spent more time in activities that made them feel good. But crucially, the volunteers who were more emotionally sensitive, following this intervention led them to experience more positive mood over the weekend. So it seemed to help them choose situations that made them feel better, and that boosted their mood over the weekend. So it's very obvious, but actually after I read this paper, it has made me, I've been a lot more conscious of it, because I think lots of things we do out of habit, we don't necessarily think, well, what would make me, what would help my mood feel better. Other research has shown, for example, we spend a lot of time watching TV, for example, even though it might not make us feel good. We kind of do things through force of habit rather than doing the meaningful things or making the extra effort to do things that would boost our mood. This is the kind of dynamic that I'm interested in, and by paying more attention to this, what situations we put ourselves in, who we mix with, what roles we commit to, we can influence our mood, and that influences our personality. When we make changes to our traits, we're also more likely to choose different situations as well. So you can try and generate a positive feedback loop. Okay. Bear in mind, there's research that shows whatever our basic personality traits, when we do things that make us feel more friendly and outgoing and conscientious, tends to make us happier. It doesn't matter whether we're introvert or extrovert. It might vary for you what kind of situations, what kind of people lead you to feel sociable and outgoing and conscientious. That might vary for different people, but when people experience those, feel that way, they tend to be happier. And bear in mind this study that showed, this was with about 19,000 Australian people. The happier they were at time one, followed them up over several years, their personalities tended to become more open-minded, more agreeable, more conscientious if they were happier. So you can see how if you start playing around with these dynamics, if you can get into situations that lead you to be happier because you feel more outgoing, conscientious, and then that sets in train some of these effects of happiness and emotion on personality. So setting up positive feedback loops. Maybe for discussion in a second, I think an important point around question mark around all this is, what about authenticity? What about being true to ourselves? And I think that's a good point, and maybe something we can talk about. I won't discuss it now. And just one final thought. A recent paper found that 30 lesson is a little video lesson on how personality is malleable, helped teenagers become less anxious and depressed over time. We're not teenagers, but I like to think maybe just this message that personality isn't set in stone, that it's something that we can work on and develop, is a healthy, beneficial message. And it's certainly one thing it did with these teenagers. It helped them to not just see difficulties in life as that they're stuck with them. They tended to acquire more of a mindset of what behaviours can I learn? How can I adapt to get over the obstacles in life? So hopefully, all this kind of material, I'm hoping, kind of spreads that message and helps us think that way. Okay, so we have some time for questions, and thank you for listening to my lecture. Thank you.
Who would like to start? There you are.
Thank you. I've got a question about how to change beliefs. So we're talking about if we can change beliefs, but how, when beliefs are ingrained, can you change that in somebody?
Beliefs, what kind of beliefs? Do you mean beliefs about
Core beliefs,
personality?
about
Or
one's own personality.
Well, I guess I'm hoping, learning about some of the literature, some of the studies that have been done, we tend to have implicit ideas and beliefs around these things. I don't know where they come from. They probably come from our upbringing or the culture we live in, maybe. But hopefully, through learning about the actual, empirical evidence that's followed people over time and showed that they change, and what I'm going to put in my book as well as stories of people who have achieved change. I'm reading Majid Nawaz's book. He founded Qiyam, the anti-Muslim extremism organization. And he, reading his story, he's someone who, if you'd met him when he was young, he used to walk around with a knife strapped to his back and so on. And, he would score very low on agreeability, maybe a hint of psychopathy. If you met him today, he's a force for good. So I don't know, learning about individual stories it can probably be compelling as well to change beliefs.
Yeah, thank you for that talk. I found the beginning particularly interesting with regards to the young, rash, childish kid who threw the thing.
Yeah.
But then you put a picture of Trump up, which doesn't bode well for the theory of kind of jumping into that. Perhaps you could speculate more, just the utility of this in the context of the school and kind of what we could do perhaps to help kids.
How do you mean about Trump? What you mean that was demoralizing to...
No, what I meant is, so you're talking about people who have one personality.
Yeah.
Then they go to a respectful role like the presidency.
Oh, I see.
How do you expect Trump to have some decorum? And that's what I meant by that.
Yeah, I see. Well, you're right, and I remember early in his presidency, I remember commentators saying, he will change. There was speculation he will change. He'll become presidential. I think he said, "I'll be more presidential than any other president." I think you're absolutely right. There's the I don't know how many. It's been is it 2 years coming up for? There's little evidence for any change, but I mean, what I've been talking about is willful change that comes from the person. So I've been, that's some of what I've been talking about is for people who want to change. To change someone who doesn't want to be changed is a very, very different prospect. And I would say, I do see what you mean, because that teacher at my school, he gave that opportunity to that peer of mine. I mean, a difference there is obviously a different time of life, adolescence, greater malleability at that time. Trump's obviously come in the end of his career, and I think it probably is easier to shape for these forces to have shaping influence earlier on. But I mean, these aren't hard and fast rules. They're processes that can work. I'm not saying they will always work. And of course, as I said just now, I'm looking at these stories of people who've changed from bad to good, to put it crudely, in their personality. Of course, there are stories the other way. There are people who early in life appear to have it all going for them and have positive personality traits, but actually ends up derailing, and they seem to go backwards in some of their traits. Tiger Woods might be an example that comes to mind. He was exalted as, you couldn't get anyone more conscientious, for example. But I mean, it's a complicated story, but I mean, in many ways, he's ended up being an emblem of the opposite. So it's not easy, and you can have negative personality change as much as positive.
I understood we didn't have time to speak about authenticity. Could you just say a few words, because it's very important?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, just a couple of things is off the top of my head. So I think it's an understandable issue, so not wanting to be fake, But I mean, one way of looking at it is actually we're not defined by our personality traits. They are not who we are. Who we are is more our values and our goals in life, what is meaningful to us. So that's what being true to yourself is. It's about following those values and dreams and ambitions and, the morals and things that matter to you. And if you can tweak your traits in the service of those goals, then you're being true, in a way you're being true to yourself. We're more than these constellation of habits of thought and behavior. So that's one way of thinking of it. Another way is, actually I've been interested, quite a few studies I've looked at how, when do people feel most authentic, feel like they're being themselves. And there was a study came out recently that found people felt most authentic, not when they were acting in line with their actual personality traits, but when they were acting in line with their ideal selves, acting as the person they would like to be. That's when people felt most authentic. And people feel most authentic in relationships as well, that bring out their ideal selves, not their actual selves. So I've been keeping an eye on this line of research about authenticity, and I think I'm very sensitive to that idea, about not wanting to be fake. And I don't want to, send a message that there's bad personalities that we should change. So I think it's more about, if you feel that you could benefit from tweaking your changing your personality to be healthier, happier, and achieve what matters to you, then I think that is a form of authenticity. Yeah, hopefully. But I'm interested in what other people think as well.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering about which direction to change in, and in particular whether there might be a difference between what's good for an individual and what's good for the environment and society. It sounds like for individuals it seems to be good to be agreeable or extroverted and so on. But I guess in a society variety is important, or having someone who is not so agreeable and who speaks what's on their mind, even if it's not beneficial or harmonious, can be good.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if we all became carbon copies of each other with identical sort of trait profiles, it would be really depressing. And there's, there are all different niches that we can occupy. And for a team, I think different teams can obviously benefit from a mix, people with different strengths and weaknesses. You've probably heard of Susan Cain's book about the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking. So while extroverts tend to be happier, and that's, that sounds like a good thing. I mean, there's definitely a place for introverts. Introverts, they can study and focus on things quietly for long periods of time, typically, to stereotype. We need people like that. We don't want everyone just going around seeking attention, taking risks. It's good to have a mix. I think probably with neuroticism, it's hard, although there is that kind of evolutionary argument that it's helpful to have people who are worriers and so on. I think on balance, it's probably better for us at least to not be too emotionally unstable. So there are some aspects of personality we probably all benefit from shifting in a similar direction, but things like introversion, extroversion, and also openness and conscientiousness, I think especially when you zoom out a bit about what's good for society and teams, then it's good to have a mix, I'm sure. I don't know.
Hello there.
Hi.
I was struck listening to you about the sense in which maybe different roles that we have bring to four different personality traits. I just wondered whether this authenticity is uniform across the whole of who we are. For example, I had a boss who was very powerful, dominant in the workplace, and I got invited home for dinner once with him, and he was like a mouse. Submissive.
Yeah.
It really shocked me. And then reading perhaps at its most extreme about Nazis, guards who could go out and do untold cruelty to people, then come home and be loving, caring people. To what extent are personality traits reflected in some ways in the different roles and sub-personalities that we may have in terms of the different roles we play in life? Is there another layer of complexity to this?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. So, I mean, trait theorists would probably argue it's all about averaging the more roles and situations you can average over. I think they would probably argue that you'll see these traits come through on average, when you sample across the different roles even. So your boss, maybe he's got other roles as well at his golf club or whatever, and you average across all of them, they would probably say you'll see these key traits, these habits of thought and emotion and so on coming through on average. but you're absolutely right. When you zoom in on particular roles, particular situations, then you see certain characteristics come to the fore. And I'm sure, yeah, by being more aware and sensitive to those influences, you know, especially if we want to be a different kind of person, I think that's really important. And I think, yeah, I completely agree with you. It's fascinating the different sides to our characters that can come out. I think I read Rafael Nadal's mother talked about how he's like two completely different people on the court to off the court, and you know, as extreme as you just said. Like, and I think that is fascinating, the idea that we have these multiple selves. So yeah, it's probably short-sighted to just reduce it all down to just those basic scores on the 5 traits. But it's interesting, you know, area that different selves idea.
I've got a bit of a two-part question. So going back to this is more to do with career success in competitive careers. So you've mentioned that high levels of conscientiousness and low levels of agreeableness predict career success. Do low levels of neuroticism predict career success? And if it does, is high levels of disagreeableness linked with high levels of neuroticism at all?
Well, they're meant to be, you know, the whole concept statistically behind these big 5 traits is they're meant to be independent of each other. So it should be perfectly possible to be high in one and low in the other, theoretically. The studies that look at correlations between the traits and career outcomes, you would think neuroticism would be a big one, but conscientiousness always comes out on top. I would say low. I mean, if you're high neuroticism is going to be a obstacle to career success, but it's not as important a factor as conscientiousness. The agreeability is low, particularly in, you know, cutthroat, highly competitive careers. Not all careers. It's especially, you know, corporate, high dog eat dog, cutthroat kind of situations. You might see it. I don't know if you saw that Jordan Peterson interview that went viral with Kathy Newman, and he was bringing up that part of the gender pay gap is because women score higher on average in agreeableness. So that's where he's coming from with that kind of thing, because he's saying that that's potentially holding women back because they tend to be more agreeable. And if you meet, you know, high-flying CEOs, they're not necessarily the nicest people, personality-wise. So yeah, that's where that's coming from.
Are the big 5 personality traits evenly distributed in the population, so there's as many agreeable people as disagreeable people, or is it skewed, the 5 traits?
As far as I know, it's there's a sort of bunching around the middle. So most of us, so you get a spread, and the majority of us are not on the, you know, we're not on the extremes. You get kind of normal distribution. So a lot of this, you know, just to describe the traits, I've been doing it, and when you read about it, it's like you talk about stereotypes a lot. A lot of us are near the middle. Do you remember that graph I put up? And a lot of us actually vary more across different situations than we even do from one another, averaged over time. So, so I think it's kind of normally distributed. Yeah.
We'll take one more before we break.
Okay.
Thanks. This is actually attempted a reply to the question, is neuroticism related to career success? In my observations from a long time in the corporate world is a lot of these very successful people are actually pretty crazy. Quite a common recipe for success is a quite high level of neuroticism, which produces a drive to succeed. Then channeled through a high level of conscientiousness will get you a very long way.
Yeah.
More sane people just will not put up with what it takes to be very successful.
Yeah. Well, in that interview, the Channel 4 interview, Jordan Peterson said the same thing. Like, you know, to reach the very top, you got to kind of give over your whole life.
You've got to be a bit crazy.
Yeah, you got to give over most of your life. And remember what I said about successful psychopaths as well. So there's very, very high flyers in many fields tend to score quite high on psychopathy, especially fearless dominance. So, yeah, I think any extremes of life, you're going to get people with unusual personality profile at the extremes of.
I spoke to someone who was the finance director of a very, very large company. He said, chief executives, they're not normal people. They have very great strengths, but they have some very great weaknesses as well.
Okay.
So if we come back to 1 o'clock, that would be great.
Okay. Thank you.